Good morning. Thank you for joining the HydraFiber team today for our webinar on surfactant or no surfactant and tips to help you improve wettability of your substrates. My name is Daniel Norden, and I am the Technical Services and R&D Manager for Horticulture Division at Profile Products. We have a couple of objectives today that we'd like to cover with you. The first is a question that we get every now and then, and growers come to us and they say, well, should I be adding a surfactant or not to my mix? And then the second one is to cover some tools that will help you to assess substrate wettability. In the lower half of the slide, we have two plants that we took pictures of when we were visiting a grower trial recently. On the left-hand side is a peat perlite substrate, and on the left is a peat HydraFiber substrate. In both instances, you can see that there are wet and dry regions of each root ball. And so the question is, how do we avoid this in production? So what are the concerns when you have wettability issues? Well, poor wettability can cause headaches for growers. And if any of you have experienced this in the past, you know that they can be very difficult to correct. The other problem with them is that they can cause issues when the plants ship to the stores and that they don't stay wet and hydrated as long as you'd like. What we know is that differing raw materials have different capacities to wet. These raw materials can be classified as either hydrophobic, and in the hydrophobic category, we tend to lump peat moss and bark under this category. Peat moss, the fibers itself have a waxy layer on them, or waxy cuticle, and this waxy layer actually repels water. And so therefore, a lot of water or synthetic surfactants are needed in order to get these peat fibers to wet up thoroughly. Bark itself is not typically viewed as hydrophobic. However, bark needs to be conditioned in order to be used in horticultural substrates. This conditioning process is usually referred to as aging or composting. Both of these processes typically rely on microorganisms in order to condition the bark so that it's suitable for growing plants in. As a result of this, fungi are one of the main microorganisms that process the bark. And the mycelium of the fungi, which are the vegetative structures of the fungi, will colonize the bark particles, and those mycelium are what is hydrophobic and repels water. Then you have hydrophilic or water-loving materials such as HydraFiber and core, which are relatively easy to wet in comparison to either peat or bark. So in this particular slide, we have a comparison that we did in our lab in Conover, North Carolina, comparing 100% peat on the left and 100% HydraFiber 160 on the right. This is a test that we call the float test that I'll get into a little bit more detail later on. But what you'll see is both of these samples were floated for the same amount of time. You can see that at the end of the test, the peat moss was almost completely floating on the water, whereas the 100% HydraFiber had almost completely sank by the end of the test. The interesting thing here is that the peat moss had 10 times the amount of volumetric water content of the HydraFiber. So even though the peat had more moisture in it, it still floated, which is illustrative of the waxy cuticle that peat possesses. So we wanted to dig into this a little further in our labs in Conover. We wanted to run some tests at various moisture contents ranging from 30% all the way to 80% moisture content. We're comparing 100% peat versus 100% HydraFiber at these different moisture contents. What you can see here, first and foremost, with the peat curve is that from 30 to 60%, it is relatively flat. The reason why it's flat is because we actually had to prematurely end these float tests because they were still floating after several hours. We also felt that based on how the samples were floating, that even after 24 or 48 hours, that there would have been very little change. And what we found is that once you cross 60%, you then greatly improve wettability. That's in stark contrast to 100% HydraFiber, which at 30 to 80% wets very easily. So the question is, does HydraFiber need a surfactant in order to wet up? Well, quite simply, no is the answer. However, there is a but to this answer. And that's because most of our customers are not currently using or growing in only HydraFiber. They are amending their current mix of either peat or bark or core with HydraFiber. And so what you amend HydraFiber with, it would help change our recommendation. So if you are a grower who's growing in peat or bark-based substrates, yes, we recommend that you use a surfactant. And that's because peat and bark have liabilities with regards to wettability. However, if you are a grower growing in core-based substrates, we do not recommend that you use a surfactant because core and HydraFiber are both very easy to wet up. So on this particular slide, we have a list of various reported benefits of surfactants. We have an asterisk here because these are not benefits that we have actually vetted ourselves. However, we wanted to illustrate and point out to you that there are other benefits that many of these companies are advertising in addition to just improving wettability. So it may be that if you do choose to use a surfactant, you may see other added benefits as well in addition to wettability. So the next question we get is, well, what's the right kind of surfactant for me? Well, there's three different kinds that we want to talk about briefly. First are liquid surfactants. These are easily applied to the mix line, and you can get very easy and uniform distribution. They're also the most economical in terms of cost compared to other formulations. However, it can be a little bit tricky in terms of calibrating the surfactant addition to your mixes. Contrast that with the granular. They're very easy to blend and add to the mix line because you can run them through a fertilizer hopper. It doesn't require an injector or complex calibrations in order to add them. However, they do tend to be significantly more expensive than their liquid counterparts. At the bottom here, we have a rough range of rates of incorporation for various chemistries. But that being said, if you do choose to go with one of these formulations, always consult the label to make sure you are using the correct formulation for that particular, or the correct rate for that particular product. The last group that I want to talk about briefly are organic formulations. Some of you may be organic growers and may not be aware that there are organic surfactants that are available. Typically, these are from the yucca plant. It is an extract that comes out of that particular plant. They do tend to be quite expensive. They are available in either liquid or granulated forms, so you do have that option. However, in my experience, they tend to be less effective than their synthetic counterparts. But regardless of which formulation you go with, either organic or synthetic, you want to be careful with them because over-application of any chemistry or any organic formulation, you do run the risk of having or seeing phytotoxicity. So then how do we add surfactants? Well, there's really two options. First, you can add it when you're blending on your mix line. This is what we recommend. And then the other option would be at the time of irrigation. So at the time of irrigation, you would inject it into your fertigation lines, and then you would apply it through a boom or a wand that way. The reason why we recommend at time of blending is because of this. So these pictures were taken from the same grower recently. On the left-hand side, you can see an example of a plant with dry pockets, and on the right, you see a plant that was thoroughly wet up. Well, what happens in the example on the plant on the left is that the water will come out of the boom or the wand, it'll puddle on the surface, and then that water is looking for the path of least resistance to drain through that soil column. And typically what it does is it finds the path along the edge of the pot between the root ball and the side of the container, and it'll run down that way. So you'll get a little bit of wetting along the sides and a little bit on the bottom just because the container is sitting on the floor or a bench. But what we see here is we see a large pocket of dry mix. The problem here is that once you create this channel that the water is following, it becomes very difficult with subsequent irrigation events to wet this dry pocket because the water is continually following this path because it's easy to follow. So if you go back with a drench or run a surfactant through your irrigation line, this dry pocket is going to resist wetting because water is going to continue to flow through this channel. So let's review some factors that influence wettability that we've already discussed. The hydrophobicity of the raw material itself. So how easily does the peat or bark or core or hydrofiber, does it wet up? That has a huge influence. The next, the presence of a surfactant. Surfactants do significantly help the mix to wet up. However, in my opinion, the amount of moisture in the substrate at the time of blending is a major factor in with regards to wettability. I've seen several instances of growers that use a surfactant and they don't adjust their moisture, and the mix is too dry, and the mix still has difficulty wetting up. So surfactants definitely help improve wettability significantly. However, the amount of moisture in the mix plays a huge role. So now let's talk about some QC tests that you can do at your organization. The first test that you can do is with a moisture scale. This particular piece of equipment is very accurate, it's simple, and it measures gravimetric water content. All the technician has to do is take a soil sample, place it on a pan, close the lid, and it does the rest. At the end of the test, it tells you the moisture content of the substrate, and so the results are very black and white. The negative to this particular piece of equipment is it is extremely expensive. This scale can cost anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000, and for most growers is probably overkill. However, we've shown this piece of equipment to several growers in the past, and several have expressed interest in looking at this because of its ease of use and its simplicity. If you do opt to go with a moisture scale, we do have some recommended moisture targets for different types of mixes. For a peat-based substrate, we recommend a moisture target of 60 to 65% moisture content. For a bark-based substrate with HydraFiber, we recommend a slightly lower range of 55 to 60% moisture. Now, you may be asking yourself, why do we have an upper limit to the moisture content? Well, the reason why is because higher moisture contents can cause other problems in your production processes, most notably with pot filling, bridging in equipment, and sticking to equipment. So that's why we have an upper limit. The next test I'd like to discuss with you is something called the float test. It requires very few tools, but it's also quite simple to do. It's inexpensive, and the results are not subjective and pretty black and white. The negative is that it does require some training, and in my opinion, the far bigger negative is that it really doesn't tell you if the mix is too wet or not. And in order to do this test, you'll need a small 50 milliliter beaker and a larger 400 ml beaker. You also need a stopwatch and some water. You can substitute a cup, like a Dixie cup, for example, a shot glass for the smaller beaker, and a phone for the stopwatch. Now, a couple caveats that I'll give you is that I would avoid styrofoam cups, and that's because styrofoam has a tendency to have a static charge to it, and mixed pieces can stick to the sides of the cup. The other caveat would be using the phone stopwatch, and that's because this test does require a little bit of hand-eye coordination, and in my opinion, I feel it's much easier to use a stopwatch that has physical start and stop buttons. So let's talk about the procedure very briefly. You first want to fill the large beaker with approximately 200 milliliters of water, and you want to place it on a flat surface such as a table. You then want to take the smaller beaker or shot glass and loose fill it with the substrates that you're testing and score the remaining excess off the top. You then want to simultaneously pour the contents of the small beaker into the large beaker while starting the stopwatch. You want to make sure you start the stopwatch when you see the soil sample hit the surface of the water. After that, you simply wait and watch until the soil sample has submerged below the surface of the water. In general, we feel that a sample that sinks in under 30 seconds would be a mix that has very good wettability. A time between 30 and 60 seconds we feel is kind of a gray area. So in this instance, if you have a test result, let's say 45 seconds, we would recommend that you go pull another sample and do further testing. A sample that takes longer than 60 seconds, we feel would have very poor wettability in a pot. This would be an instance where the technician would want to go notify a production leader in order to stop production and make the necessary corrections. The last test I want to describe today is simply called the squeeze test. The advantage to it is that it's very easy to do right at the mixing line, and it has very fast results. The negatives are that it requires quite a bit of training on the part of the technician to get comfortable to assess the moisture content of the mix. And that's because this test is very subjective, and there's large room for interpretive error. So in order to do this, what you first want to do is take a substrate sample, pick it up with one hand, and then squeeze your fist around it. After you squeeze your fist, you want to release your finger and then evaluate what the mix sample does. In this particular example, you see a very dry peat that's straight out of the bale. And after she releases her fist, you can see that the sample does not clump at all, indicating that the sample is too dry. On the other spectrum, you can see in this example a sample that is way too wet. When she squeezes her fist, you can first see that water is starting to wring out of her fist. That's usually a very bad sign and a very clear indication that the sample is way too wet. Then, after her hand is released, you can see that you can see her finger imprints, and you can also see that the sample is forming a very tight clump and is not falling apart on its own. Some folks will also evaluate the amount of mix that is stuck to their palm and fingers as an indication for how wet the mix is as well. Lastly, we want to show you what a mix sample at proper hydration looks like. When the fist is balled, you see that there's no water running out of her fist. Then when she releases it, you can see that it is starting to form a clump. However, we can see from the middle of the sample that the clump is starting to fall apart on its own. This is indicative of a mix that is at the proper moisture content. So lastly, I want to cover what happens if you experience a wettability problem in your greenhouse. What are the actions that you should take? Well, if you happen to catch it early enough and you only have maybe 100 pots that you've potted up, one thing that I would strongly advise is that you actually empty those pots and re-pot them up. However, I think in most instances, most people do not catch it until they see a significant number of pots run in a bay. And so in that instance, your really only option is to do a surfactant drench. We advise that you consult the label for whatever product that you use. In our experience, persistence and completing multiple drenches is usually necessary. Typically, the label will have either a one drench rate, where you do a drench with a high concentration, and then there's also typically an option for a lower concentration but multiple drenches. In my opinion, it's typically more effective to do a lower rate with multiple drenches. But again, make sure you consult your label to make sure you're following whatever they recommend. Lastly, I want to point out that because there is a plant growing in this mix, you do have to be careful that some crops may show some phytotoxicities. So it's important to treat a small area first and then look for phytotoxic symptoms. And then if you don't see any, then you can proceed with drenching the rest of the crop. The problem here is that these problems can be very difficult to correct once you notice them in the greenhouse. And so that is why we highly recommend that you avoid this if at all possible by implementing the right QC procedures into your mixing processes. So let's review some keys to success. First and foremost, whether you use a surfactant or not, it's crucial that you properly manage the moisture content at the time of blending before the pots are filled. This will greatly reduce or even eliminate any wettability issues that you may experience. Peat and bark mixes, we highly recommend the use of surfactants in these. Lastly, we feel that it's very important that you adopt one of the QC tests that we've outlined in this presentation into your organization in order to assess substrate wettability. We thank you today for your time, and we'd like to let you know that any of our team members are available should you have any questions. Our contact info is on this slide, and at this point, I'd like to take any questions that anyone has.